Hey everyone, welcome to Algebra 2, and we're going to talk about the first assignment, which is variables, terms, and expressions. So this whole first unit is just review of a lot of topics from algebra, and then we're going to build on those topics and functions and linear functions as we go through the year. So we're going to talk about some basic terms. Variables, one of them. We talked about variables before. We talk about terms, and we talk about what an expression is. So we've seen variables before, something like x that could represent a number. With terms, you're talking about a grouping of numbers and variables, which contain either multiplication or division. And then an expression is just a combination of different terms that doesn't contain an equal sign. So equations have equal signs, expressions don't. Now we're going to look at some of the examples. So if you look at first exercise number 1, how many terms does the expression have? Well, terms are combinations of multiplying and dividing, or it could be single numbers. So in this case, there are 1, 2, 3 different terms. And they say to evaluate it. And when they say evaluate, they mean solve. So it says show your calculations. We're actually going to use the calculator for this because we're using the calculators all year. So x is -3, so that's going to involve some substitution. So I'm just plugging in the -3s where I see each x. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my calculator, turn it on, and then I'm going to type that into the calculator. So we got 2 parentheses, -3 squared plus 3 times -3 minus 7. It's important because when you are typing something like this, how you would say it is how you type it in the calculator. So like for this one, we get +2. So when x is -3, the answer you get out in this case would be 2. And C talks a little bit about combining like terms because they ask you if you added these together, what would you end up with? So, going to part C, if I take this, 2x squared plus 3x minus 7, and I was to add 5x squared minus 12x plus 2, I'm looking to combine the like terms. The expressions don't change when we're adding. So, in the case of the square, the x squared, the exponent's going to stay the same. So you got 2x squared and 5x squared, which would be +7x squared. 3 and -12. If you add those in the calculator, you can get -9x, and then -7 plus 2 would be -5. So that's just a little review of some of the things that we're going to come across eventually, as the year goes on. And this kind of leads us into the idea of what a like term is. So like terms have the same variables raised at the same power. So like that whole idea of the 5x squared and 2x squared, they're like terms. It's kind of like how the number system works. If you think of 5x squared as a 5 with 2 zeros, and 2x squared is a 2 with 2 zeros, if you add those together, you get 700, which would be a 7 with, again, 2 zeros. So if I was to add 5x squared and 2x squared, you get 7x squared. Now, we're going to talk about some of the properties that we're going to see. And they're going to go through some of the justifications in the steps. So like exercise 2, when you think about adding like terms, a lot of the times will that you use some of the properties in math that are being done and allow you to add or subtract like terms like that together. So we're looking at exercise number 3, which is on the back, and they're asking us to use some of the properties of real numbers. Now the commutative property is basically taking two numbers and rearranging them. So you rearrange the numbers, in this case 2 numbers, in any order. You should get the same thing with adding and multiplying. The associative property changes where the parentheses are. So like the whole idea of PEMDAS, first one parentheses, if you add or multiply but you change where the parentheses are, you always focus on those first. And distributive property, which you can do with addition or subtraction, in this case again you are taking a number or a term and you're multiplying it by each part. So exercise 3, we're just going to kind of fill in some justifications based on the stuff that we just talked about above to figure out what properties are going to be done. So in the case of this first one, the 8 is being distributed and the 5 is being distributed because the multiplication has taken place. So this would be distributive property. I'm going to abbreviate that. And I'm going to put, in this case, a multiplication. Now we see, for the next step, you see the parentheses appear to help kind of reorganize and put the focus on certain numbers. So like in this case, that would be associative property of multiplication. Now, after that, what we end up having is the commutative property, because you'll see from here to this line, they kind of reorganized. They moved some of it around. So they did a little rearranging. So that's commutative property of addition, because there are plus signs between it. Then what they did was they used distributive property, but they divided out the x's. So this one will be distributive property of division. And then they moved the emphasis after they added the 16 and 15 together. They moved the emphasis of where the parentheses are. So that one would be associative property of addition. So a couple big things, just make sure you use the right property, but then also include what operation is being done with it. So you'll see there's a few steps for this. And again, it's more of a process of elimination. We talked about rearranging, changing where the parentheses are, and then distributing would be multiplying or dividing to take the terms and either put them together or break them apart. Now the last part is one of the calculator tricks that I tell all my Algebra 1 students to use. If you're trying to find something's equivalent, so they're saying this is equivalent to the answer we got, which they should be because we just used properties of math to find it. So what you'd want to do to check that is you want to go to your calculator, and it says equivalent, so what you want to do is go turn it on, go to y equals. You want to type each in like it was a graph. And what I tell my students to do is type the first one in, y1. So we got 8 parentheses 2x plus 3 plus 5 parentheses 3x plus 1. Go to y2 and then type in the answer you got, 31x plus 29. And then you just want to double check, make sure everything's good. So I'm going to look at the first one again because it's long and I got a lot of stuff in there. So I got that, and 3x plus 1, we're good to go. See, then you hit second and graph. And you'll notice the tables are the same. So each expression, no matter what number I put in, I get the same answer out. Now you could also, if you had the graphing ability, if you look at the graph, you could use the graphs. If the graphs are the same exact graph, same thing. They would be equivalent. So when it says how can you test that equivalency, you can use the graph function or the table function in the graphing calculators. Okay. So as you're working through the assignment, just make sure to look back at the notes. And if you're in class right now currently and you have questions about the assignment, raise your hand and I'll get over to you as soon as I can.